Okay. So in my experience, newly promoted executives tend to experience very similar outcomes. They find themselves in a position, they're initially quite happy and excited to be there. They find themselves in a position where they look around, all of a sudden, there's not as much support and there's a much more isolated place. So they find themselves suddenly exposed to a whole different world, a whole different level of expectation, and that can be really quite daunting. The technical skills that got them to that level are all still there, but the skills to navigate an executive table, navigate a board, navigate partnership in companies can be really quite tricky. And stress as a consequence of that grows. They end up overworking to try and prove that they belong, so they overcompensate by trying to do those things. It becomes quite uncomfortable and stressful space, and it doesn't need to be that way.
The executive management table.
Yeah. Okay, well, it impacts them around the management table and around their meetings and their communication in quite significant ways. Because people become self-protective and they're not really sure they belong there yet, what tends to happen is every time a board member asks them a question, it feels like an attack. Now, it's not an attack necessarily, it's just a question, but they feel like it's an attack. So they've got to always come up with the right answer. And if they haven't got the right answer, then they get a bit panicky and start being self-protective around that, and that just exposes them as being insecure in their space. So then they start attacking people and they start getting angry at the world around them, and it becomes a vicious cycle at that level. Or another thing that can happen is they find themselves unable to think as strategically as they formerly could. What happens when we're stressed is our ability to think strategically and our ability to think creatively dries up. And the overwhelmness and the busyness and all those sorts of things mean that you miss really obvious stuff. And so what would have been obvious to you, it's obvious to the person when they get home. On the weekend, they think of the great answer they should have had to the board meeting on Friday, but that happens on Sunday, not in the meeting on Friday. And this is a consequence of a stressed brain. It's just what happens when brains are stressed. We shouldn't be surprised that brains do this when they're stressed. It's what happens, but it doesn't make it any more fun. So one of the things you can expect to see happen at a board table, or even in communication and the way they approach their work, and for that matter, their life outside of work, if you find yourself becoming less flexible, so you're less likely to say yes to anything, it's no first, then question later. If you find yourself being attending to details where you would otherwise think more strategically and creatively, if you find yourself being oversensitive to fairness, like why do they get to go home and I've got to work late, or why do I have to do this extra project where they don't have to do it? So those are the sorts of symptoms you're going to see: closed-mindedness, defensiveness, more aggressive communication. It's more blame and guilt associated with the conversation, more fear in conversations. It's just going to it puts a stopper on the free flow of information across the board table, which is really important. People are trying to second guess what they're trying to say, which means from the functioning of the meeting, it's really quite disruptive, because everyone's got to try and position their information in a way that's not going to get everyone upset. So it becomes quite an emotionally difficult thing to manage, just to get that meeting done. So they're the sorts of things: closed-minded, obstinate, hypersensitive to fairness, take everything personally, a lot of blame, a lot of guilt, a lot of fear, that kind of stuff.
So what's the underlying problem that's leading them to feel stressed?
Well, the underlying biology is quite straightforward, or it's actually not true. It's quite complex, but it's relatively simple to understand. Our mind and brain develops models of the world, and its primary focus and primary function is to keep you safe. As you step into a space that's largely new, where there's more responsibility, you're exposed in that space, and it's potentially an unsafe territory for your brain. So what your brain does, it measures safety according to how much control and orientation you've got. Do I know what I'm doing? Do I know what's expected of me? In this space, clearly you don't know what's expected of you yet. There's a pain avoidance, pleasure-seeking imperative that says avoid stress and avoid pain and avoid things that are damaging. And again, in this environment, the risks are much higher, the stakes are higher, so that the jeopardy is much higher than it was when you're just in a merely technical role only. And there's also a sense of attachment that we need. We need to feel significant and valued. And sometimes at the board table, we feel like we're, as I said before, we're like the kid who's been allowed to sit at the grown-ups table. And we don't feel like we really belong there yet. We're not part of the gang yet. And so your brain is trying to establish these things. And what it does it in either an avoidant or an approach mindset. So the problem with avoidant mindsets is they operate from a highly emotional part of the brain, that it's much less cognition, much less thought going on, much less executive functioning. And that means your ability to see opportunities and to see what people are actually communicating and understand them properly is jeopardised. So if you do that often enough, that avoidant mindset becomes habituated, it becomes your normal way of doing things. So everyone around you comes to expect you to be closed-minded to new opportunities. They expect to fight you to get any information from you. And it's incredibly stressful for you and incredibly frustrating for everyone around you. So that's what happens in a physical sense. Your brain it's operating more like a child rather than a grown-up, and it becomes a problem over if it's extended too long, and it becomes a habituated problem. It becomes the way you are, and stress feels like it's a normal part of existence. And then, of course, the problem with that is it becomes misdiagnosed. So your boss then thinks that you need to go on a communication skills training course, or you need to go on a time management training course because you're procrastinating difficult decisions, right? It's nothing to do with time management or communication skills. It's got everything to do with your level of stress and your ability to function in a calm, connected and effective manner. And that is solvable, but it's a different pathway to a communication skills course. Well, ultimately the way you solve that problem, the way is you've got to grow a brain that is more effective and more approach-oriented. It takes time, and you've got to grow a different way of thinking. You've got to grow a brain that doesn't dial up stress as easily. So just like it's analogous to being healthy, physically healthy, there are things you need to do to get physically healthy. Exercise, eat less, mostly plants, and move more. Well, it's similar for a brain. There are certain things you can do to grow a brain that allows you to be more open and flexible and authentic and connected and calm in an otherwise disruptive, highly fast-paced, changing world environment. And you can do that through either my one-on-one coaching, executive coaching, programs which people engage in, or you can access coaching through an online program I've developed called the Think Well Program Online. You can, there are hybrid versions of both of those things. So simply put, you've got to grow a brain in a certain way, have your brain grow in a certain way, and then you just naturally become a more calm person. A lot of my clients will say, Nigel, I'm doing much of the same thing I was doing before, I just feel differently about it. And that makes such a massive difference to my day. I get to sleep at night, when I'm home, I'm talking to my husband or my wife properly. I'm not just complaining about work. When I get to work, I'm engaged with the people around me. It's a very, very different way of thinking and a very, very effective and powerful way of thinking. But it starts with conversation.